President Biden has now signed the Inflation Reduction Act.
The act aims to lower carbon emissions by 40%.
Could help reduce global warming. Their business has gotten a much-needed boost lately from the government's Inflation Reduction Act.
Most significant investment ever in climate change.
But at last, we have arrived.
We've changed the world.
This is just another chapter in the Biden administration's story of promises made, promises kept.
Electric vehicles and cake. Not an obvious analogy, but hear me out. If you wanted to make a cake, but it was hard to find a supermarket, and then when you did, you only found a Harrods when really you wanted an Aldi, and you only had a pretty basic knowledge of making a cake anyway, you probably wouldn't make the cake. You'd order a cheaper one online. But if someone offered you billions to make a cake, sure as hell you'd figure it out, and I bet some top-tier bakers would come knocking on your door to get in on the action. Well, that's where we are with the Inflation Reduction Act, a ginormous piece of climate policy that is shifting the tectonic plates of the electric vehicle and clean energy transition. But is it working? Will we get to have our cake and eat it? Confused? Well, so am I. Let's go back in time.
The Fully Charged Show is generating positive energy with its live events all around the world. Next up, it's Fully Charged Live Canada. Click the top right of the screen to get your tickets today.
In August 2022, President Joe Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, aka the IRA, into law. And it earmarks $369 billion for emissions cutting measures. And to quote Professor Jesse Jenkins, the bill works primarily through carrots and not sticks, i.e. incentivizing clean tech rather than taxing carbon emissions. And so there are masses of incentives in the IRA for clean energy and EVs to make this possible. But for electric vehicles, the big headline is that you can get up to $7,500 in tax credits when you buy an EV. That's huge. Big money off the cake, to extend the analogy. But nothing comes for free. To get that $7,500 tax credit, there are rules around the percentage of components that must be manufactured or assembled in the US, or a country with which the US has a free trade agreement. And those percentages increase each year to 100% of battery components and 90% of critical minerals by 2028. That is a gargantuan task, and so there's a feast of IRA goodies to make that all possible. Money is there for the taking at every part of the EV value chain, from material mining, refining, cell manufacture, battery pack assembly, and EV assembly. And they all build on top of each other, up to $50 per kilowatt hour. So if a manufacturer produces enough 70 kilowatt hour batteries to power 1 million electric vehicles, the resulting tax credits could total $2.45 billion. So far, sounds pretty jammy. In fact, $56 billion of investments has already been announced, generating a projected 40,000 jobs and over 430 gigawatt hours in additional battery capacity, an increase of 59%. Mind-boggling stats. But you don't get calorie-free cake. Now, we made it this far without talking about China, but talk EVs for long enough and we'll say the C word eventually. The big undercurrent here is the US's desire to reduce the dependence on China. And that's really challenging when the overall EV supply chain is overwhelmingly in China. Materials-wise, for example, over 50% of lithium is processed in China. In the US, just 1%. 75% of battery cells are made in China. The US, just 4%. There are 7 times more planned or operational gigafactories in China than the US. And we saw during the pandemic with the chip crisis that an overdependence on any one market is just not that sensible. But it's more than that. There is a requirement in the IRA that the US EVs don't include materials from a foreign entity of concern. Ergo, China. So what's really going on here? Well, I think it's time to phone a friend.
I want to be clear, it's not just China that is like called a foreign entity of concern under the law. It's also Russia and North Korea and Iran, like the standard panoply of American, American skeptical countries around the world. But China obviously is like the only country that kind of really matters in terms of the global EV supply chain. There is a focus on how right now the US does not know how to set up a manufacturing line at scale at globally competitive cost for like LFP batteries, let's say. And I think there is interest in there's an awareness that any future US competitiveness globally will follow from bringing that know-how and bringing an understanding of that technology to the US and like letting it exist in US factories with US engineers, US based engineers like looking at it and learning from it.
When you start looking at the list of countries with a free trade agreement, the list is pretty extensive. And unsurprisingly, they're countries that are home to a lot of the core battery ingredients. Australia, Canada, Chile, South Korea, they all have reserves of lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, all in their collective repertoire. And beyond those countries, Japan and the UK have both signed critical minerals deals with the US to broaden their access to those credits. Neighbouring Canada is in prime position to capitalise on the IRA, and recently VW and Stellantis did exactly that.
It got a bit sticky there because Stellantis announced first, and then Volkswagen announced a few months later, and then Stellantis thought that they weren't getting enough incentives that Volkswagen had promised, and then they threatened to pull out, and so it became a whole big game about see if they could get some more money, and so it's been quite a situation here in Ontario to figure all that out. Canada's electricity is incredibly clean across most of the provinces. And for Ontario, which has automotive manufacturing and other manufacturing as well, and you're making clean energy products such as batteries and electric vehicles, you can say, look, it's the amount of energy that you are putting into that battery in its manufacturing point is 1/10 if you were to go and set up in somewhere else.
I'd not thought about that. Canada's cleaner grid means cleaner batteries. But with a load more incentives over the border, Canada has to basically match what's available through the IRA. It's IRA by proxy, equipping EV players a lot of motivation and bargaining power as they flock to North America. Kia is the latest in the lineup, announcing a $200 million investment in its EV9 factory in Georgia, the same state where Hyundai is building a massive battery factory. Now what's interesting here is that, sure, there are some homegrown US battery darlings, but the big car companies are all partnered with South Korean, Japanese and Chinese battery powerhouses. And they would be lost without this East Asian battery expertise, or certainly wouldn't scale at the rate or cost required. SK On, SK Innovation, Samsung, Panasonic, LGES, they're the Michelin star bakers here. And now, with these IRA bankable tax production credits worth billions, these battery bodybuilders just got steroids. The US is clearly largely friendshoring critical materials and onshoring EV assembly and the battery know-how and expertise that it desperately needs, which simultaneously helps South Korea and Japan to catch up with China, but also potentially makes others a little cross, as some regard this as protectionism, where government policies essentially restrict international trade in order to boost domestic industry. Basically the opposite of globalization. The US has just overtaken Europe in its gigafactory capacity pipeline, and that's not necessarily gone down that well.
The way it looks today, China will continue being number one. And then it really is a competition between Europe, the US, maybe some other countries, who will be number two, actually. We are unfortunately competing against each other. We should see a lot more collaboration and cooperation because we're stronger together. But there, indeed, I think battery packs and battery cells, given the sheer amount of subsidies in the US, are likely to be manufactured a lot more in America than here. I give you an example. So on average in the industry today, at scale, they say it costs around $100 per kilowatt hour to produce a battery cell, right? And in the US, the subsidy is up to $45 per kilowatt hour. So up to half of your costs of actually producing battery cells can be subsidized. I mean, honestly, if I could, I would build a battery factory in the US. It's just that it's not the engineering skills I have.
It's fascinating, but also kind of obvious, right? Global car companies are going to go where they'll be most warmly welcomed. Here in the UK, the government have just announced millions to Tata to ensure they choose Somerset and not Spain for their $4 billion 40 gigawatt hour battery factory. In my potentially naive outlook, wouldn't it be nice if it wasn't US versus Europe versus UK, but make room for all of us? After all, we are all in this together. At least should be. Regardless, industrial strategies and financing them is important. But back to the US. There's something really curious going on. Let's take a moment to see where the money is going and where this so-called US battery belt is forming.
I think when you look at where the battery belt is forming, particularly this kind of core battery belt that goes from Georgia to Kentucky to Tennessee, South Carolina, These are largely more Republican-friendly states, although I would note that they're not all Republican-friendly states, and they are also states where the Democratic Party kind of sees its long-term future. Those states are not as supportive of climate policy historically. But maybe if they get EVs, number one, they'll be more supportive of climate policy and have Republican administrations, which could be very good for like the long-term outlook for climate policy in the United States. Or second of all, that they'll just continue to attract growth and continue to suburbanize and continue to become more democratic friendly.
The IRA is very much a partisan legislation, and US politics is very black and white, or rather red and blue. So would the IRA survive a Republican administration?
There's going to be a lot of corporate lobbying to save a lot of the IRA if a Republican takes office. And that's because these companies have made physical investments expecting support from the government, and they will continue to expect it going forward.
Please support our Stop Burning Stuff Patreon and help us to tackle misinformation about electric vehicles and clean energy. Reviving and creating industry that's good for the economy is hopefully going to be a bipartisan priority. So the big question, 1 year on, is it working?
I think it depends on your metric for success. If your metric is the IRA causing the US to decarbonize, switch to EVs, clean electricity faster than it would have otherwise? Absolutely, yes, no question. We're very clearly accelerating. We're on a real liftoff point. If your question is the IRA going to keep the world from warming to C? Is it going to allow the US to meet its 2030 Paris Agreement target? The IRA is getting a good amount of the way there. The US has committed under the Paris Agreement to slash its emissions in half compared to their all-time high by 2030. So that's very soon. That's 7 years away. I think with the IRA, we're on a path to cut them like 37 to 41% if you look at the models below their all-time high. But the goal is 50. We still need that last 9%. And how we're going to get that last 9% is still a really open question.
Like most things, the answer is it depends. But it puts the world on a far better emissions reducing trajectory than if it didn't exist. The IRA is very unlikely to tip the balance completely away from China to claim EV victory, but it is shifting the needle and redistributing the EV ecosystem. And that is already proving a massive proverbial kick up the bum to up the ante and make this a clean energy transition with a little more urgency and a bit more resilience. In other words, we can have our cake and eat it.